MajiMonsters is a tabletop fantasy role-playing game, which means the game takes place in the collective imagination of its players. One player runs the game, commonly referred to as the Game Master, while everyone else dictates how their character is portrayed in it. These people are called player characters. Like many RPGs, MajiMonsters is aided with miniatures, combat grids, gaming tokens, character illustrations, and all manner of things that bring the game to life, but they're not necessary. All you'll need to play MajiMonsters is the core rulebook, some paper and pencils to keep track of your character, monsters, and notes, as well as some gaming dice. Most of you are probably already familiar with these role-playing basics, so what makes MajiMonsters different? MajiMonsters is all about monster catching. If you're the generation that grew up with Pokemon, Digimon, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Card Captors, or any other monster catcher, then this is the tabletop RPG for you. In MajiMonsters, your player character is referred to as a binder, named for their ability to bind fantastic monsters to magically prepared crystals called Drajules. Once a monster is bound, they can be summoned forth by the binder to serve at their side in combat. These monsters are, as you may have guessed, the MajiMonsters that give the game its namesake. Alright, let's start talking about binders, MajiMonsters, what makes them special, and combat. Each binder and MajiMonster has 6 attributes: health, a measure of their physical fitness and vitality; strike, a measure of their aim, coordination, and skill at arms; protection, a measure of their ability to avoid damage through the use of armor, evasiveness, or preternatural skill; magic, a measure of their ability to conjure and direct magical forces; discipline, a measure of their strength of mind, magical resilience, or presence; and speed, a measure of how quickly they can react and move in a given amount of time. Each MajiMonster also has 2 unique attributes player characters do not possess. They're brawn, which is a measure of their physical strength and endurance, and talent, a measure of how much control they have over the magic spells and techniques they use. While each attribute score is on a different scale, suffice to say that the higher the score is, the better. We'll get into how these scores affect combat in a minute, but for the time being, it's worth noting that most player character scores will look very similar, if not the same. The distinction between characters doesn't come as a comparison of their attribute scores like other traditional pen and paper RPGs. Rather, it is their unique mix of characteristics and abilities that make them different from the player next to them. A player's attribute scores will also pale in comparison to that of a MajiMonsters. MajiMonsters will have varied attribute scores, giving you the player a lot to consider when choosing which one to battle or bind. This gives the game a ton of depth, makes the monsters intimidating, and gives the player a healthy amount of respect for battling or capturing MajiMonsters, the game's centerpiece. Don't worry though, we've added plenty of things to make your characters unique. During character creation, players will select from different characteristics and abilities that help flesh out your character and add to their personality. Characteristics are innate qualities, developed skills, quirks, or physical features that any player can have. Maybe your character is extraordinarily fast, devilishly handsome, has an incredible memory, or an inhuman tolerance for alcohol. Characteristics are fun role-playing aids with in-game mechanics. Abilities are more geared towards your character's profession as a binder. While many abilities can be selected by any class, each class has an archetypal ability and class-only abilities as well. For instance, the magically attuned Concordant has Synergy, an ability gained when directing MajiMonsters attuned to the same affinity he or she is. This ability is not available to any other class. Characters can cash in experience points to gain new abilities or characteristics throughout gameplay, giving your character plenty to work and grow towards throughout a game's campaign. Alright, on to combat. Whether facing a gang of rival binders, or forced to defend yourself from a group of wild MajiMonsters, eventually things are going to come down to a fight. During combat, each player summons and directs a single MajiMonster to fight in his or her stead. Each participating MajiMonster makes a check, adding their speed as a bonus, creating a list in descending order of initiative. If you played these games before, you'll know this isn't a new concept. It's just one that works the best. From there on out, combat takes place in rounds. During a MajiMonster's turn, it is allowed to move and make a combat action. A MajiMonster can move its speed times 5 feet each round. If you're using miniatures represented on a combat grid, this is simply just your speed score in squares. Combat actions are the heart of the combat turn and usually involve the monster directing an attack at an opponent with a combat technique. Each technique lists 2 stats used to make an attack roll. For instance, this technique uses strike versus protection, meaning the MajiMonster using the technique rolls 2 6-sided dice, or 2d6, and adds its strike score as a bonus. If the result is equal to or more than the target's protection score, it's a hit, and then it deals the listed damage and effect listed on the technique. That's the basic concept of an attack, but MajiMonsters offers much more depth to combat than just that. The grit system is an abstraction of just how hard or willing a MajiMonster is to fight for its binder. A binder can direct a MajiMonster to spend grit when making attack rolls or using techniques to empower the roll. An empowered roll uses two 8-sided dice, or 2d8 to hit, giving the monster much better odds of success. Players may also use binder actions during their MajiMonsters turn in combat. These actions allow players to become more involved in the fight, such as by healing, using items, providing your monster a bonus, giving them a directive, or using a class ability. This can also include actually binding new MajiMonsters to a Drajul to join your service as a binder. Overall, combat offers all the complexity and strategy you've come to expect from traditional fantasy role-playing games, just with a monster-catching twist. In fact, given how diverse each monster is, the sheer amount of techniques in the game, the customization from monsters gaining levels, unique traits and equipment, as well as managing your grit, you'll find there is considerably more depth in this game than others. This brings us to a close on our first introduction and mechanics video, but we haven't even began to scratch the surface here. If you like what you've seen, we encourage you to back MajiMonsters so we can make it a reality together. If you have any questions, please ask. And, as always, thank you for your contribution.